Valachi had set an example, and in the following years, a handful of mafiosi would follow him in defecting from what he had called a second government. Vincent Teresa, a power player in the smaller Patriarca crime family of the northeast New England area, turned on the mafia in 1971. His life wasn't in danger yet, but he was serving a prison sentence. He learned his supposed colleagues not only were failing to care for his personal family, but had stolen $4 million of his illegal earnings. This would be a recurring complaint from mafia informants. Low-level associates Willie Boy Johnson and Raymond Ween both betrayed their superiors for failing to take care of their families while they served time in prison. Both would cause headaches for their up-and-coming bosses, John Gotti and the Bonanno's Joseph Massino, respectively, though neither were ruinous. Teresa's own memoirs, My Life in the Mafia, came out in 1973, the same year he faced his biggest test as a government witness. Against the Patriarca crime family, he is credited with 20 convictions. But things were different when he was called to testify against Lucky Luciano's old friend, mafia associate Meyer Lansky, then treated by the press and government as public enemy number one. He'd boasted of organizing gambling junkets to London on Lansky's behalf and secretly forwarding the gamblers' debts to Lansky. But he later told the ghostwriter of his second book titled Vinnie Teresa's Mafia, he did so under the expectation Lansky was going to be allowed to retire in Israel. When Israel denied him citizenship and kicked him out, Lansky was hit with 3 indictments shortly after he was dumped back into the United States. One of those was a tax evasion case from Teresa's alleged payoffs. Lansky had an airtight alibi. He was recovering from surgery in Boston the day he allegedly was handed a payout from Teresa. Meyer Lansky died a free man. So did Teresa, despite being later convicted in witness protection of drug dealing and wildlife smuggling. He wouldn't be the last mobster turncoat to fall back into his old ways. Jimmy Fratianno would offer some representation for the West Coast mafia families, outshined and outlived by their East Coast counterparts. When he flipped in 1977, he had risen to become acting boss of the Los Angeles crime family, but was pressured by charges of being a co-conspirator in the bombing of renegade Cleveland gangster Danny Green, and from being targeted for assassination himself. His life story would come out in 2 books from different authors, 1980's The Last Mafiosi and 1987's Vengeance is Mine. The latter book led to the government phasing out his witness protection benefits, the total value of which they estimated at $1 million since his defection, and only giving him basic protection from threats to his life. The move and the $1 million quote led him to scream slander and betrayal in a Washington Post interview, but the Justice Department flatly stated they had no intention of creating a mafiosi's pension plan. In any case, Fratianno avoided mob retribution and passed away in 1993. Teresa and Fratianno answered one complaint about the Valachi papers. Their stories offered a perspective greater than that of a soldier at the bottom rung of the criminal elite. The top prize, however, would be the life story of a boss, and the 1970s saw a few false starts. Peter Moss had reached out to Frank Costello, the successor of Lucky Luciano, about telling him his story. But 10 days after Costello finally agreed, he dropped dead. Meyer Lansky, who apparently never had the $300 million fortune credited to him in the 1960s, considered both a book and a movie deal for the money and to try to change his notorious public image. Both projects fell through. Finally, in 1974, the American public was given the most significant mob story imaginable, the life of its founder, Lucky Luciano, or so it seemed. The story began in 1961. Lucky Luciano remained in exile in Italy. He had briefly set himself up in Havana, Cuba, before the U.S. government found out he was meeting with his old partners, and the U.S. had the Cuban government send him back. For the rest of his life, he was under suspicion of involvement in the importation of heroin into the United States, with government scrutiny hindering his later, apparently legitimate business ventures. His old colleagues in the States had been sending him money, but but the stipend was cut back dramatically after their business partner in Cuba, dictator Fulgencio Batista, left the country to Fidel Castro's insurgency at the end of 1958, costing the Mafia their officially sanctioned casinos. Luciano had one asset left to shore up his income, his life story. In 1961, Luciano began talks with film producer Martin Gosch and began work on a screenplay for a biopic. This is not disputed. For obvious reasons, the bosses in New York told him this would be unacceptable. Here is where the story becomes murky. According to Gosch, Luciano was still dead set on getting his life story out. The commission be damned. He secretly agreed to tell Gosch about everything he had done, as opposed to the screenplay that Gosch characterized as essentially fiction, but only on the condition that he wouldn't take it to the public until 10 years after he died. Gosch would continue to meet with Luciano to hear his tale until Luciano suffered a fatal heart attack the following year. Obligingly, in 1972, Gosch convinced author Richard Hammer to turn his notes of these meetings into a book. The Last Testament of Lucky Luciano was published in 1974, a year after Gosch himself had died, leaving Hammer alone to answer the many questions raised about the book's legitimacy. Just before release, the New York Times' Nicholas Gage put out an article giving reasons to be skeptical. The advertisements for the book claimed the conversations between Luciano and Gosch had been taped. This would have guaranteed the story's authenticity. Those tapes don't exist. Richard Hammer and publisher Little Brown and Company blamed Penthouse magazine, who had serialized the book, for first making this claim, which had, they admitted, been carelessly copied in their own ad. Even worse, Gosch's notes of the supposed meetings were destroyed, and Hammer, who had no reason to believe they would be lost, hadn't bothered making copies. Luciano's two sisters, his mistress, and two colleagues would attest to the book's authenticity, but the publisher was forced to admit some of those people were also entitled to a share in the book's royalties. With the infallibility of the source material dismissed, Gage went in for the kill, listing a number of inconsistencies between the public and historical record, and Luciano's supposed story, which Hammer would attempt to rack up to failing memory, of a man who died in his 60s. Hank Messick, the man who gave Meyer Lansky the legendary $300 million net worth, and Peter Moss were both quoted admitting Gosch and Hammer repeated some of their own mistakes when Luciano presumably would have known better. Most damningly, Luciano was quoted discussing the business of a Bahamas casino, which didn't open until 2 years after his death. The FBI also took time to examine Luciano's alleged confessions and wrote off the Last Testament as useless, explicitly accusing the surviving author of helping whitewash a potential fraud. Mob journalist Jerry Capici and Lansky biographer Robert Lacey reached similar conclusions, and yet there is far from unanimous consensus on the Last Testament's value as a source. John H. Davis's Mafia Dynasty simply refers to The Last Testament as Luciano's autobiography and uses it as the source for the story that Luciano set up Vito Genovese's career-ending narcotics conviction by paying off the key witness. In the introduction of his Mafia Encyclopedia, crime author Carl Sifakis justifies his use of The Last Testament, among other things, by pointing out it was one of the first books to raise questions about the legendary Sicilian Vespers. Nevertheless, Sifakis sabotages himself by bringing up the logistical impossibility of arranging all these hits as a reason to call it bunk. When Gosch's Luciano claimed he had done just that, organizing hits nationwide, before calling them all off at the last minute. Even Selwyn Robb's seminal Five Families quotes Gosch with a disclaimer, his description of Lucky's calls for cooperation within the Mafia being close enough to what he probably would have said behind closed doors. The controversy cost Little Brown and Company $800,000 in a canceled deal to license the paperback rights at the time of initial publication. But the book remains in print in the 21st century. As late as 2013, film producers were even willing to throw away money optioning the book, paying to lock away the rights, to adapt The Last Testament into a Luciano biopic, but never actually getting a movie into production. And Richard Hammer's career wasn't tainted enough by The Last Testament to even put a dent in his career as an author, where he would return to true crime. His explanation to modern Luciano biographer Tim Newark was that much of the challenged material could be explained by the book's subject's own self-serving embellishments, and the publisher had shot down his suggestion to add explanatory footnotes to help distinguish these from reality. It took another decade for a verified boss's life story to come out. The author was Joseph Bonanno, the namesake boss of the New York family that had evolved from Maranzano's old gang. He had been one of the original bosses on the commission and had ruled his family undisputed until 1964. The year before, he had conspired with Joseph Magliocco, boss of what was then the Profaci crime family, to kill rival bosses Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese. But Magliocco's chosen hitman, Joe Colombo, gave up the plot to get his boss's job. 1964 saw Joseph Bonanno disappear, apparently kidnapped, and the commission appointed one of his rivals, Gaspar de Gregorio, to replace him. There followed 4 years of war to oust Bonanno's son, Bill Bonanno, during which Joe Bonanno returned and the commission replaced De Gregorio with another proxy, Paul Scacca, before Joe Bonanno suffered a heart attack and finally went into exile in Arizona. According to Bonanno, he first started serious work on an autobiography while he was under investigation that would eventually result in a 1980 obstruction of justice conviction. He said it helped relieve stress. The end result, published in 1983, was A Man of Honor, the autobiography of Joseph Bonanno. He was also smart enough to come up with a reason why the rules against giving up the organization's secrets didn't apply to him. The Mafia's code of silence is known as omerta, an Italian word translated as manliness, and had evolved from a disdain against taking problems to the authorities as opposed to solving them oneself. Bonanno stuck with this archaic definition to insist that, by putting out his story at his own initiative without becoming an informant, he kept his oath and proceeded to denounce Valachi, Teresa, and Fratiano. If you're wondering how Bonanno's excuse went down with the rest of Cosa Nostra, Gambino boss Paul Castellano wanted him dead, and when Joe Massino became a Bonanno crime boss, he tried to rename the family after himself. There are two major issues with A Man of Honor. First, Bonanno wrote it with no legal immunity, so he couldn't write anything potentially incriminating. Second, as the title suggests, Bonanno wrote the book with an agenda. Bonanno's introduction should immediately put any discerning reader on guard, as he tries to dismiss his public reputation as a gangster and drum up sympathy by admitting his command of the English language isn't the best. This is why he recruited a scribe, Sergio Lali, as the co-author. Reviewer Walter Goodman looked at the end result and called Lali a wannabe Mario Puzo. Bonanno was effectively born into the Sicilian Mafia, and he tells a legend of how they formed in the original historical Sicilian Vespers, a 13th century revolt against French occupation. Bonanno's father was one of their men of honor, idealistically described as the problem solvers for the common folk of Sicily. While he spent part of his childhood in New York, Bonanno, like his mentor Maranzano and many other mafiosi, didn't relocate permanently until Benito Mussolini cracked down on the mafia to consolidate his power, and Bonanno took the opportunity to frame himself as just another refugee seeking freedom from fascist oppression. Discussion of Bonanno's criminal interests is sparse, but he wasn't shy about discussing the commission or his relations with other bosses. He counted among his friends Joseph Profaci, a boss that somewhat sensational mafia encyclopedia spoke of mostly in terms of his greed, and Albert Anastasia, Carlo Gambino's predecessor, who was best known as the mafia's rep in the old syndicate's enforcement arm, Murder Incorporated. Gambino, who took Bonanno's spot as New York's preeminent boss, is derided as a weak squirrel of a man, and, against conventional mob wisdom, a lackey of his contemporary, Tommy Lucchese. Bonanno boasted of having created a Pax Bonanno between the other bosses, but he may have fudged the timeline to oversell his work. In 1955, Bonanno writes, Frank Costello stood down as the boss of what is today the Genovese family after one of Genovese's men, historically identified as future boss Vincent Gigante, made an attempt on his life, and Bonanno says he talked Albert Anastasia down from starting a gang war to avenge his ally. And so peace reigned for 2 more years before Anastasia was killed by Genovese and Gambino. In reality, Costello and Anastasia were both shot in the same year, 1957. Bonanno insists he kept his family out of the drug trade, but he also placed himself in Palermo during a 1957 meeting where Sicilian mafiosi were cleared to smuggle and deal heroin in the United States in exchange for a cut to their American counterparts. Bonanno's entourage included his third-in-command, consigliere Carmine Galante, who was convicted in 1962 of drug trafficking. Interviewed for CBS 60 Minutes to publicize his book, Bonanno disavowed knowledge of Galante's drug dealing, going much further than the book, which doesn't even mention Galante. In the book's recounting of his fall, Bonanno states that his 1964 abduction was pulled off by his cousin, Buffalo boss Stefano Magaddino, who tried to talk him into standing down before throwing him back out onto the streets 6 weeks later. This explanation convinced few, given the trouble he'd gotten himself into. A genuine abduction would have probably ended in the turbulent Bonanno's death. Perhaps more importantly, the so-called kidnapping took place a day before he was supposed to appear before a grand jury. It is very likely Bonanno faked his own abduction to avoid both mafia retribution and a contempt of court conviction. Anyone who's done any study into the mafia can find at least one reason to see a man of honor for the puff piece it is. But even in a vacuum, would a real man of honor be as petty as to mock Al Capone over his name? Or resort to hitting a rude waiter with a glass pitcher? At one point, Bonanno notes, men who know their own strength, who know their mind, and are secure, don't have to brag or make a show of their strength. In short, he decries posturing to cover up weakness, but then what is the reader to make of his own gratuitous literary quotes and bragging of his erudite nature in the introduction? Shortly after initial publication, Bonanno sued Pocket Books, a subsidiary of original publisher Simon & Schuster, over their cover on the paperback edition, which invoked a more conventional image of the mafia than Bonanno would have liked, and the book would only bring him more troubles. The groundwork for effective prosecutions of the mafia was set in 2 laws that followed its exposure, both written in part by Notre Dame law professor G. Robert Blakey. The first, a section of a larger 1968 crime bill, was Title III, written to end the practice of illicit wiretapping, exemplified by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover's antics, and replaced it with a procedure for court-approved wiretaps and bugs. With electronic surveillance now above board, the results could be used as devastating evidence against mobsters in court. The second law was RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Among other provisions, under the RICO Act, leaders in a criminal enterprise could be prosecuted for crimes carried out by their underlings, even without direct involvement. If they got a cut of the profits, as is inherent in the structure of the mafia, where criminal earnings go up the chain of command, the boss is as guilty as the original perpetrator, and the penalties for crimes proven to be in the prerequisite pattern of racketeering were exceptionally harsh, calculated to create defectors and cooperating witnesses to make prosecutions even easier. The year A Man of Honor came out, a pre-Trump Rudy Giuliani had secured the assignment of building the most significant RICO case of the time, an indictment of the commission itself. Though his boss would question the claim, Giuliani said he was inspired to launch such a prosecution from Bonanno's book and 60 Minutes appearance. In 1984, Joe Bonanno was subpoenaed for another grand jury in preparation for the case, and his refusal to answer questions won him a brief jail sentence for contempt of court. The commission case targeted the bosses of all 5 families, and the capstone of the indictment was for operating the so-called Concrete Club. Mafia-controlled concrete companies colluded in a price-fixing scheme that inflated construction costs in New York City, and business was driven to these companies by the Mafia's soft power and controlled unions hindering projects that wouldn't do business with them. A man of honor, the writing of which Bonanno had by now admitted was not such a great idea after all, was introduced as evidence of the commission's existence, as were the tapes of mobsters who also thought he'd done a disservice to them. Ultimately, the commission case only convicted 2 bosses, but the prosecutions didn't stop. They've never stopped. It wasn't obvious yet, but the golden age of the Mafia was done.